know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
Is the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching. Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Good evening. A busy day in the Westminster Village. The government wins a vote with a big majority on the so-called Windsor framework. I'll explain tonight to you why I think that's a very big long-term mistake. And Boris Johnson being grilled for 3 hours by a parliamentary committee this afternoon. The question has to be, can he survive? Will his political career continue beyond this? And on Talking Pints, I'll be joined by retired US Admiral Michael Hewitt, who now works in the nuclear industry. I'm going to ask about small modular nuclear reactors. Are they practical? Are they possible? Could they be the answer to the net zero challenges that so many seem to believe in? But before all of that, let's get the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Nigel, thank you, and good evening to you. The top story on GB News tonight. Boris Johnson has told the Privileges Committee, hand on heart, he did not lie to MPs over Partygate. The former Prime Minister says, although he takes full responsibility for the gatherings in Downing Street during lockdown, his statements in the House of Commons had been made in good faith. He went on, though, to criticise the committee of bias in its investigation, and particularly the chair, Harriet Harman, of being prejudicial, suggesting the proceedings were extremely peculiar.
I really must insist on this point. People who say that we were partying in lockdown simply do not know what they are talking about. People who say that that event was a purely social gathering are quite wrong. My purpose there was to thank staff, to motivate them in what had been a very difficult time and what was also a very difficult day in which the Cabinet Secretary had just resigned.
Boris Johnson. Well, the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has seen off a backbench revolt today by Tory hardliners opposed to his Brexit deal with Northern Ireland. 22 Conservative rebels, including Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, voted against the Stormont brake regulations. The key element of the Windsor framework aims to give the Stormont Assembly a greater say on how EU rules apply to the province. Well, the vote was passed with 515 votes to 29, with Labour and other opposition parties also backing it. The RMT union has suspended strikes due to be held on the 30th of March and the 1st of April. That comes as discussions continue between the union and the rail delivery group in the long-running dispute over pay, jobs and conditions. And police have today linked 2 attacks where men were set alight in both Birmingham and in London. And a warning if you're watching on television, we're about to show the video of the moment a man was set alight. Some may find it distressing. CCTV footage shows one of the victims, Mohammed Reyes, walking home, being approached before he was sprayed with an unknown substance. Police say it's linked to a similar attack on a man in Ealing in West London last month. A man's been arrested on suspicion of 2 counts of attempted murder. Now, Scotland's First Minister today issued an apology to mothers who were forced to give up their children for adoption in the 50s, 60s and 70s. Nicola Sturgeon condemned the practice, which is estimated to have forced 60,000 women to part with their children. 33 people have been injured after a ship toppled over in a dry dock in Edinburgh this morning when the vessel, which belongs to the Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, became dislodged. It keeled over at an angle of 45 degrees. 21 of those injured were taken to hospital for further treatment. You're up to date on TV, online, DAB+ radio and on the TuneIn app. You're with GB News, the People's Channel, where now it's time for Farage.
Well, a very busy day here in the Westminster Village. It all kicked off with Steve Baker, yes, the Northern Ireland minister, issuing the most bizarre statement demanding that Boris Johnson back the Windsor framework, else he might be thought to become a Nigel Farage. We'll talk a bit more about that later on. The vote happened in Parliament and the government won with an absolutely massive majority. There were 23 Conservative members of Parliament that rebelled. And I'll talk a bit more over the course of the next hour about the Windsor framework and why I think it is far, far away from the spin that Rishi Sunak put on it. I have to say, I feel that Euroscepticism in the Conservative Party has gone back to where it was at the time of Maastricht, 30 years ago, when 26 Tory MPs voted against third reading. That worries me. I'll tell you more about that. But then it was Boris Johnson up before the committee this afternoon, about 3 hours of interrogation and grilling. Well, people will have to make their own minds up, including the committee, and the committee have to report over the course of the next 3 weeks. Did Johnson willfully, deliberately mislead Parliament? But more importantly, they were also looking for, was Johnson reckless in what he said to Parliament? Now, that's a much lower bar than you'd ever get in a criminal court. If it turned out that Johnson was suspended for 10 days or more from the House of Commons, then that would trigger a process that would inevitably lead to a by-election in Uxbridge, his constituency, which I've no doubt he would lose. It would effectively, I think, be the end of his political career. What did I think of the testimony that he gave? Well, when he said that the leaving parties were essential, I was reminded that at that time, we were told to stay in our houses, to only leave for an hour every day, not to go and meet our elderly or dying relatives, not to socialise in any way at all. And the head of state, I suppose, the Queen, set the most extraordinary example, because there she was, in the chapel in Windsor, at the funeral of her husband, sitting there on her own. And while she was doing that, the people that were making the rules that we were supposed to abide by, well, the Prime Minister says he didn't really understand the rules, so he had to get counsel, and he was given guidance. He told the House of Commons again and again, I was told, no rules have been broken. Today it turned out that the people he got the rules from weren't people like Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary. No, they were people like Jack Doyle, press officers, junior press officers, young people who he himself had appointed. I have to say, I found his response at times slightly rambling, repetitive, angry, irritable. But the big question is, can he survive this? I think he probably will. Give me your thoughts, Farage at gbnews.uk. And I think he'll survive it because they will not, it seems to me, absolutely be able to prove that he lied to Parliament. That's my guess. To get a more dispassionate view, I'm joined by GB News political reporter Olivia Utley. Olivia, what's the talk over the road post this grilling, I guess is all we can call it?
Well, yes, there's no feeling that Boris Johnson sort of covered himself in glory, but nor is there a feeling that it was an absolute fiasco for him. On a number of issues, it felt like Boris actually had the upper ground. The committee were trying to build a case that it was obvious to Boris Johnson that he broke the rules. And he made the argument, and he made it quite well, that if it was so obvious, why would, for example, there be a number 10 official photographer there? Why, when it was reported in the Times, did no one really raise an eyebrow? He also did quite a good job of sort of lumping himself in with the civil servants who were at these gatherings as well. And essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but saying, well, if I broke the rules, didn't they too? On the other hand, there were a few areas.
I have to say, I didn't find that very charming at all. No. At school, you just said that he was dobbing the minutes.
Well, yes, he then sort of turned it on his head and said, it wouldn't be fair to accuse them of lying, so it isn't fair to accuse me of lying either. But yeah, a bit of a toady move there. But then there are a couple of areas where it did feel as though he was losing ground a bit. As you say, this question of whether he recklessly misled Parliament. So there was no sort of evidence that he was, no smoking gun evidence, as it were, that he was lying. But the committee zoned in on this issue that he didn't set the record straight. He stood up and told Parliament what it turned out was a mistruth. And then he had a long time. And what did he do to establish whether or not he'd told the truth? Did he go to lawyers? Did he copper plate that evidence that he gave to the Commons?
And that's where the word reckless would come in.
And that's where the word recklessly comes in.
Yeah.
So, yes, they were prepared to believe that he accidentally stood up and told the Commons a lie because that's what his advisers had told him. But then wasn't he duty-bound, the committee argued, to go and check that evidence and to make sure that it was correct? And he didn't do that. So it does seem quite likely that he recklessly misled Parliament, so they might come down on that. I mean, zoning out of the whole thing a little bit, what Boris Johnson presumably wants to achieve from this is a route back into politics, a route back into frontline politics. And it could be that even if he survives this committee hearing, as you suggest, his political nous will be gone, his reputation will be ruined. Because, yes, he could get out of it on technicalities. It could be that he didn't quite understand the guidance. But everyone sitting at home did understand the guidance. And will that have been an edifying spectacle to them to see Boris Johnson sort of trying to wriggle his way out of this?
I mean, whatever happens, it does not increase his standing with the Great British public.
No, if it's a victory, it'll be a Pyrrhic victory.
Yeah. Another thought. I woke up this morning and I could see that we were going to have two former Prime Ministers, Johnson and Truss, former Conservative leader, Duncan Smith, voting against the Windsor Framework. I mean, some really quite big names and former cabinet ministers too. And I thought to myself at 7 o'clock this morning, well, of course, Keir Starmer, this clever lawyer, he's clearly going to get the Labour Party now to vote against or to abstain, to embarrass the government, yet he didn't do it, and it passed with a massive majority. Why on earth didn't Starmer have a go?
Well, no, it's very interesting that because, yes, as you say in your opening remarks there were only 20 or so MPs who voted against the government, but there were quite a lot of abstentions. It seems as though there were plenty of Conservative MPs on the backbenches who didn't like the Windsor Framework, but Rishi Sunak handled them carefully. He's a competent, slick politician, and he knew how to handle them, so he managed to get them not to actually vote against the government. But, as you say, if Labour had chosen to withhold their support, then it actually would have been pretty damaging for the government. But that's not Mr Starmer's style. Sir Keir Starmer's style, I should say.
There we are. Olivia Rutley, thank you very much indeed. Well, I've made my thoughts and my criticisms of the way Boris Johnson has handled this afternoon pretty clear. But be in no doubt, there are fierce Boris defenders out there. Their numbers in the country are fewer than they were. Their numbers in Parliament, I sense, are probably fewer than they were. But a lot of the Tory MPs, they see Boris as a winner. The man who won twice in London, who led them to an 80-seat majority. And somehow they think, if maybe, as they drink they take their glass of wine and they move it across the water like sort of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobites, that somehow he might come back and save them. And one of those resolute defenders of the former Prime Minister is Michael Fabricant, Conservative Member of Parliament for Lichfield. Michael, it wasn't a very edifying display this afternoon, was it, that committee meeting?
No, it wasn't, but I don't think it was Boris's fault. I think it was the committee's fault. I've served on select committees, and I have to say this one was very, very bizarre indeed. There was a lot of repetitive questioning, not necessarily because they wanted to get answers and were not getting them. It was because they simply weren't listening to the answers or weren't concentrating. I think there were a couple of outstandingly good questioners. I think both might be lawyers, Andy Carter and...
I saw that.
Yeah. And, I've forgotten his name, the chap with the Scottish accent. He's a colleague of mine who'll never forgive me. And an Italian name has just gone out of my head. It's terrible.
Right. You'll be forgiven. Look, but here's the point.
Alberto Costa came to me.
Here's the point, Michael Fabricant. This is the man in charge of setting the most draconian set of rules we've ever lived by in this country. And we all damn well knew we weren't supposed to leave our house for more than an hour a day. We weren't supposed to go and visit sick and dying relatives. We weren't supposed to socialise at that moment at all, not even have a friend round in the garden. I mean, a lot of us did, but we weren't supposed to do any of these things. And here's the bloke in charge of setting the rules, claiming he didn't quite know what they were, so he had to take guidance. And then today we found, I think for the first time, that the guidance was not coming from civil servants, was not coming from senior figures, but young press officers like Jack Doyle. It's not very believable, is it?
Well, it did come from others as well, and he did make that clear. But you're right, he was hoisted by his own petard. I mean, he did not want any rules. In Sweden, they gave guidance, like, try not to meet people, try to keep distance, but we'll leave it to your good judgment. And you know what? Although their death rate was slightly higher than that of the UK, it wasn't that bad. And we, by the way, didn't do badly. We actually did better than Germany.
The long-term damage to health statistics, mental health statistics, the economy.
Well, we don't know.
I think Sweden and Florida look better than us. But here's the point. We didn't do a Sweden. And even if Johnson's instincts were to do a Sweden, which they may well have been, and if you believe his articles in the Telegraph over the years, that we've always thought there was a...
But he was advised otherwise, and this is the point.
But Michael,
Nigel, Prime Ministers have to take advice, and he took advice from the scientists, and you and I can probably agree that it was the wrong advice. And similarly, he was given advice that in a business, you imagine GB News if we were now in the dreadful COVID pandemic. You and I would be meeting in small rooms, and the idea is that you are in a bubble. So there were...
Yes, no, I fully understand that.
There were guidance, so he genuinely thought he was obeying the rules.
I don't think we'd have been sitting out in the garden, about 40 of us, drinking glasses of wine at what was clearly a social event.
But the garden, I might add, was probably the safest place to be because it was well ventilated, and the photographs I've seen are only 2 or 3 of them together, and people scattered.
They were social events, they weren't work events. It's as plain as the nose on your face.
Well, he was saying this was an event where they'd had previously a meeting indoors and afterwards went outdoors.
Well,
I know we can go over and over about this, but I genuinely believe that he thought he was operating within the rules because the rules were clear. And as a colleague of yours and mine, and, whom I have huge respect for, Tom Harwood said, people are conflating the anger because of what happened during COVID and the fact they couldn't see their parents. And you mentioned, people not being able to go to funerals. He couldn't go to his mother's funeral either. So he, too, suffered all that.
Do you think overall he's a truthful man?
He writes very good fiction, but I think overall, yes, I think where it counts, he's truthful.
If you're his strongest defender...
Well, you're the ones who said, look, he's a very good writer. But hey, where it counts, I do not think he misled Parliament because I think he genuinely believed he was operating within those complex rules.
He did mislead Parliament. He's admitted that he misled Parliament on the basis of the information that he was given, and that's a slightly different thing.
Well, he said on the basis that he'd had the fixed penalty notice, and my actual view is that the biggest mistake Boris made was actually accepting a fixed penalty notice, like someone who's caught for speeding, and then not challenging it in the courts because he didn't want it to... And I think if he had challenged it in the courts, because after all, Starmer was in a tiny room socialising. They didn't issue a fixed penalty notice there. So it's quite... And
that's a fair point. No, I get that. Final thought, will he survive all of this?
I think it all depends on what the committee does. Now, if they, as you know, the rules are that if they were to give him more than 10 days, it could trigger, and it would trigger actually in practice, a by-election. And I'm pretty sure that would be difficult in a place like Uxbridge.
The Commons would support it.
I don't know that they would, but they probably would because of precedent. It would be a free vote. But you know what? I don't think it's necessarily going to be that. When I look at other people who've done far more serious things, actually, they got far less than...
I think he'll survive too. Michael Fabricant, thank you very much indeed. In a moment, I'm going to be joined by Martin Howe, KC. We're going to explain to you what the Windsor Framework actually is and why Parliament passing it today may well be a mistake for all of us.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512,
Virgin Media Channel 604,
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236,
And YouView channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB+ radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions are, those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway,
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
it's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Well, we all knew there was going to be a vote today on the Windsor Framework, and it was very bizarre, really, because a fella called Steve Baker, I'm sure you've seen him on your TV screens, he's terribly self-important, and he sets himself up to be one of the great Brexiteers. That is, of course, until he gets a ministerial car. It's amazing how people change once that happens, and we were thinking that maybe Boris Johnson would vote against this deal. And Steve Baker was stopped in the street first thing this morning, and this is what Minister for Northern Ireland, Steve Baker, had to say.
So really, both of them should be backing the Windsor Framework today. And what I would say is they're both better than this. We've reached this point thanks to Liz Truss setting the process in train, and today's measures are better, of course, than the protocol that Boris Johnson put in place, a protocol which he spoke about, and those things he said turned out not to be accurate. So, you know, he's got a choice. He can be remembered for the great acts of statecraft that he achieved, or he can risk looking like a pound-shop Nigel Farage, and I hope he chooses to be remembered as a statesman.
Well, there you are. Thank you, Mr. Baker. Yes, poor old Boris Johnson. Well, he did vote against the Windsor Framework. Perhaps he has become a pound-shop Nigel Farage. But you see, unlike you, Mr. Baker, I tend to be fairly consistent in my views when I believe in sovereignty. You yourself, Mr. Baker, March last year said we should trigger Article 16. We have to get the UK single market back and Stormont up and running. As I say, it's amazing what a ministerial car will do. Never mind the ERG have kicked him out of their group, I'm very pleased to say. Now, I know whenever we talk about Northern Ireland, whenever we talk about protocols or frameworks, a lot of you just look on misty-eyed and think, what the blimmin' heck is this all about? And yes, of course, we get the Prime Minister telling us it's all going to be marvellous. Well, we're going to try in the next few minutes to explain this to you, why it matters, not just for Northern Ireland, but potentially for the whole country. I worry that today's the day Euroscepticism died in the Conservative Party. Well, who better than Martin Howe, KC, co-author of the ERG report that Marc Francois announced to the world yesterday. Martin, we were told by Rishi Sunak this would mean that trade between the mainland and Northern Ireland would now be unimpeded. Is that correct?
No, it is not correct. The problem is that if you go by the government message, you often find there's a gap between the government spin on agreements with the EU and the reality of what's in the legal texts. And we've been spending the last 3 weeks going through those with a fine-tooth comb. There will not be unimpeded trade at all. There will be some facilitations of trade which benefit supermarkets, for example, but they have to register. They have to register their warehouse in Great Britain. They have to register their branches in Northern Ireland on the list.
And all of this to trade within the United Kingdom?
That is all to trade within the United Kingdom.
Right. So that, yes, that was a big Sunak spin that clearly isn't right. But it's OK, because there's a break. There's going to be a break, a Windsor break, and any EU legislation that we don't like, we can simply veto. That's what we were told.
Yeah, the problem with that break is that it's a much, much more restricted version of a break which Norway and the EFTA countries have enjoyed under the European Economic Area Agreement. They have only used it once. Norway used it once in 2011. They abandoned it in 2013 when they blocked the adoption of a post office directive, which they felt strongly against that the EU had adopted. But they abandoned it because the EU can retaliate if you use it. So the Stormont break, I think, is a complete distraction. It's very difficult to use in theory, even in theory, and in practice, it's unlikely ever to be used.
So that means that as the EU makes more law for its single market, that law will be applied to Northern Ireland.
Exactly. But it's more...
So to legal purposes, they're still virtually part of the European Union?
Yes, indeed. All purposes to do with goods trade, goods manufacture, customs, and other features, state aid, very important. They're locked into the system. But the thing about this arrangement, the Windsor deal, it's said to be removing some European Union law from Northern Ireland. In fact, that one claim by the government is, I think, only 3% is left. That is completely untrue, absolutely untrue. 100% of European Union law under the protocol remains applying to businesses in Northern Ireland.
All of this, should be damaging our trust and faith in the Prime Minister, shouldn't it?
Well, what I'm talking about is what objectively is in the legal text and comparing it with these statements.
Rather than making political comments.
I don't want to get into...
I was just trying to get you in trouble, that was all. But on the bigger picture being not just Northern Ireland, but if Northern Ireland keeps having to accept new EU law, doesn't that make it more difficult, for the rest of the United Kingdom to get rid of EU laws, because there becomes a gap between legislation and regulation within our own country that could become enormous? So in a sense, could it not be that this Windsor framework in some ways is tying us closer to EU law?
Well, yes, because when I last came to speak to you, it was about the retained EU law bill, which allows a lot of this EU law to be reformed.
Which I was excited about.
Indeed, but in Great Britain.
Yeah.
But it doesn't allow it to be reformed in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
So as that process goes through, there will be divergences between laws in Northern Ireland and laws in Great Britain, and that causes pressures. Like, for example, there was an example last week. Parliament has banned the importation of trophy animals. I mean, you may not agree with that because obviously you go tiger hunting from the back of elephants and you like to bring your tiger heads home.
My enemies would all think that, yes.
but you know, that is the law that Parliament has decided upon, to ban the importation. They can't do that in Northern Ireland because it's not an EU law. And what's more, because if we imposed restrictions on goods from Northern Ireland into Great Britain, that would even further damage Northern Ireland businesses. They can't stop the trophies coming in to Great Britain from Northern Ireland.
Will the retained EU law bill still go through? Will we actually get rid of many, many thousands of EU laws?
Right, well, there are two questions there. One is, will it go through? And it's being faced, there's opposition in the House of Lords. So it depends on the determination of the government to push it through and, if necessary, play ping-pong between the Commons and the Lords to get it done. Well, what will it achieve? I mean, my concern about it is there's got to be political will in really going through these laws and deciding, you know, this is not something we ever wanted, we don't want it anymore, and not just a sort of tick box exercise where the civil service say, oh, Minister, it's far too difficult to do this, let's just keep the same EU law.
Well, we'll see where we go. Martin Howe Casey, thank you for coming in and explaining. And I have to say, I find it all really rather depressing. You know, a new Prime Minister, the same old spin, the same old nonsense. In a moment, we'll tell you about Sir Keir Starmer's pension and why it's different to yours.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference. And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island's story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Well, anything to do with Boris Johnson evokes very, very strong emotions from you, our viewers and listeners. So I'm going to read out quite a few of your comments today. I asked the question, can he survive this? Terry says, in my view, his career never began. It was all smoke and mirrors. He has achieved the square root of nothing, unless the destruction of the economy by lockdown is an achievement. Terry, I don't agree with that. I think he was a much better mayor of London than either Ken Livingstone or Ken wasn't that bad, but certainly better than Sadiq Khan, and he appointed some very good people, and he joined the Brexit cause, and that was vitally important. Yes, it may well have been at 5 minutes to midnight, but he did join it, and as Prime Minister, we did leave. Not in the way we wanted, but we did leave, and they are Boris Johnson's big achievements, and they can't be taken away. Ryan says, I hope not, as he is very good fun. Although that doesn't mean I believe everything he says. If he can survive this inquiry, he will have to work hard to hold his seat. Now, Ryan, this point is crucial. We did a Farage at large in his Uxbridge constituency a few months ago. London is going through very, very big demographic change, and it's a demographic change that suits the Labour Party far more than the Conservatives. I really think, with the Conservatives way behind in the polls, Johnson would struggle very hard to keep that Uxbridge seat. I suspect he'll be heading off somewhere to Oxfordshire, Gloucestershire, or something like that if he survives. But I think, on balance, I think he will. Nigel says, I believe it is Nigel. He can't come back from the humiliating dramas of what he has done before, frankly. He has to either retire from politics or rethink his career, or, if elected as an MP, take a seat back. Well, look, I'm sorry, Nigel. He's actually, as a human being, got lots of options, and that's because he can go and make a lot of money on the speaking circuit, and I think he may well fancy himself for the top job in NATO, which comes up. Stoltenberg finishes his 10-year term. Boris Johnson, by September, could be running NATO. And for those of you that write to me and email me and say that I'm a Boris hater, I'm not a Boris hater. I actually find him very amusing. I'm pleased he was around for the referendum. It's just that his relationship with the truth simply isn't good enough to be a Prime Minister. And he's been elected as a Conservative, and he governed, frankly, as a Liberal. Now, what about pensions? So Keir Starmer making a very, very big play that they will reimpose the lifetime pot on pensions that the Conservatives have got rid of in the recent budget. And yet we learn, as a former Director of Public Prosecutions, we learn that Starmer has got a special arrangement where that won't apply to him, and he can take out lump sums and pay far less tax than all the rest of it. So Starmer in danger here, I think, of being branded a hypocrite. And the other piece of news that was out from our leaders today was Rishi Sunak has published his tax returns for the last 3 years. Most of his income has come in the form of capital gains, and he's been making between £1 and £2 million a year over the course of the last 3 years, and paying between £250,000 and £400,000 a year in the form of tax. But I don't think that it's Rishi Sunak's tax returns that are of interest. His wife's would be a lot bigger and far more interesting, unless, of course, she's still a non-dom, though I think she's dropped that status. Now, we talked about Northern Ireland to try and get a view, to try and understand a bit more what was in that framework agreement. Similarly, in a moment, we're going to talk about nuclear energy. So much is talked about it, so little is understood. I'll be joined on Talking Pints by retired American Rear Admiral Michael Hewitt. Hopefully, we'll finish up the session enlightened.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's that time of day. Yes, absolutely. It is Talking Pints. I'm with Rear Admiral, retired Mike Hewitt, US Navy. Welcome to Talking Pints, Mike. Marvellous stuff. Now, a naval aviator. We were, earlier this week, looking at some of the aviation exploits of the dam busters and wartime and Cold War work, because that station at Scampton, of course, is where the Vulcan bombers were and all the rest of it. You were over 30 years in the US Navy.
I was fortunate enough to join in the early 80s during the Reagan-Thatcher buildup. One of these young kids that found itself flying an airplane 2 years after I joined the Navy, hunting Soviet submarines, which was a pure NATO mission, a pure operational mission. And really what Reagan and Thatcher said to the Russians, we will be on every submarine you have, 24/7, and we will kill it if we have to.
Yeah.
And that, to me, was one of the ways we won the Cold War. But worked very closely with the RAF, flew with the Nimrods, and it was just a fabulous mission for us.
So career, 30 years, 31 years in the Navy. You obviously loved it. Must be quite difficult. You come out after all those years, and yeah, you got a pension and all the rest of it, but to sort of decide what do you do with the rest of your life. And you know, you come and see me today, and you're still completely involved with all the geopolitics that you were when you were in the Navy, maybe more so. But energy, and you're CEO of IP3, which, as I understand it, you're looking at nuclear energy as being perhaps a way we can solve many of the world's problems. But before I come to that, kind of with the Cold War, we knew that the Soviet bloc was we felt that it was the potential threat. But boy, oh boy, hasn't the world changed. You know, 10 years ago, I didn't think China posed a territorial threat of any kind at all until this president came along. And I just wonder what you made of it, because America, the UK, NATO, we've been pretty solid in our support of Zelensky against what Putin's done. But what no one's looking at is on the other side of this equation. It appears that Xi, Putin, between them, are building quite a big alliance against us.
Oh, absolutely. I think if you look at Ukraine right now, it is a manifestation of bad leadership on behalf of the United States, the United Kingdom. As we like to say, democracy and freedom aren't intrinsically motivated on their own. You have to engage, you have to lead. And I believe that what's happening in Ukraine right now wasn't from the last 2 years. It was really a retraction of our countries from foreign policy and leadership, starting in Iraq, followed by Syria, where we let the Russians come in and really dominate that space. And then, of course, Crimea in 2014, and now Afghanistan. And when you look at these things, it really is, we stepped out of our leadership role and they filled the void.
So you think that the Chinese in particular and the Russians see us as being weak?
They absolutely see us as being weak. And if you follow just in the last year at the Beijing Olympics, Xi and Putin were together. They made a huge statement about the geopolitical order of the 21st century. And 2 weeks later, Putin invades Ukraine.
And Iran, now on joint naval exercises, I'm told, with Russians and with Chinese. Now, the world is quite a frightening place. One of the effects of the Putin invasion was a rocketing price, particularly of natural gas, and Europe finding itself in a very, very big problem. You know, Trump told the Germans, if you remember a few years ago, don't become, and we in this country, of course, rely on import, although we've got more than enough oil and gas, but we do rely on those imports to keep us going. Yet at the same time, Mike, we've gone for wind energy, Boris Johnson in particular, as part of our net zero strategy. How big a role do you think energy policy is playing in world geopolitics right now? I
think in many ways, energy policy or energy sovereignty, as I've written about, is the Westphalian principle of the 21st century. In the 20th century, it was oil. Then now it's energy. And unfortunately, you go back 6 or 7 years, the price of energy and the energy poverty you have here in the UK today wasn't caused by Putin or the pandemic. It was caused by a total commitment to decarbonization at the expense of energy security. And what we find ourselves in now throughout Europe is a skyrocketing price of energy because we don't have enough of it. And so the Chinese and the Russians have known this. They've known this from day one. And in many ways, they walked us down the primrose path of decarbonization. They don't attend the Paris Climate Accord. They don't attend COP26. They refuse to.
Yeah, they might just pop along, but...
They're happy to see us overcommit to renewable energy, vilify fossil
and of course, they're burning coal, aren't they? In gargantuan amounts.
The Chinese open a new coal-fired plant every 10 days. The Chinese and the Russians think of energy strategically. We think of it through the narrow lens of decarbonization. So there you have the differences between their authoritarian governments and ours. And I think we're in a lot of trouble over that right now.
But on balance, you know, I'd rather we weren't burning huge amounts of coal here in central London. I can see Battersea Power Station in the background there. And in 1952, the smog was horrific. So we obviously, all of us, want to have cleaner forms of energy. We want to have energy security, and I agree with you on that point entirely. But the cost factor that you mentioned, now you're an enthusiast, and you've got a business, you know, promoting the idea that nuclear energy is the way forwards. But nuclear energy is very expensive, isn't it?
It's always expensive when you build a nuclear power plant. But you have to also balance the fact that it runs 95% of the time, day, night, all weather, for 60 years. So on balance, the CapEx is always higher, but the energy you get from it for the life of the energy and resilient power, which is not dependent upon the weather or fuel, is the big attribute that we need to focus on.
And this is base load power, isn't it?
It's abundant and base load power.
Yeah, because of course the obsession that this building behind me has with wind energy, and the problem that we have, of course, is intermittency with wind, with solar, and actually we've stuffed it with subsidy, so it's not really been particularly cheap either. Obviously there are concerns. You know, there's 3 Mile Island, there's Chernobyl. You know, there are obviously risks with nuclear energy. But here's the big story, and here's where I want your help. We keep reading in our newspapers about Rolls-Royce. Yes. And we know that Rolls-Royce make these tiny nuclear reactors that go in the back of our Trident submarines, and we're quite excited about the AUKUS deal, which you and us have done with Australia, and that could mean great business for Rolls-Royce, and so we're excited potentially about that. So we keep reading about small modular nuclear reactors. We're told they're a fraction of the size of the old monstrosities that we were building in the 60s. But my question is, have any actually been built yet around the world? Is this a pipe dream? Is it 15 years away? Is it achievable and doable in a reasonable time frame?
Well, I think your point about Rolls-Royce is a critical one. Rolls-Royce in the United States, in Westinghouse and General Electric, were really the founders of nuclear power, both for the military and for our civilian use. Collectively, they built over 200 nuclear power plants, so they have a rich history in nuclear power. But these were the large gigawatt-sized plants. The future of nuclear power, rightfully so, is in a small modular reactor. So think of it as factory-built. Think of it like building an aircraft. You reduce the risk and the cost by building it time and time again in the same way. So what you have with Rolls-Royce, which is an aerospace company that builds the nuclear power plant for your Navy today, the technology leap is very simple. It's a basic light water reactor that they've been building for 80 years. The difference is they're going to build it in a factory. They're going to drive down the price point. And the beauty of an SMR is I can put it where I need the power.
Are these operational yet anywhere in the world?
Well, in many ways, they're still in development, but I don't believe that that's the challenge. The challenge is to get on with committing to a demand signal. So what you have with Rolls-Royce is a fully funded development activity to get their SMR ready for fleet operation. What you don't have is a demand signal to actually buy it. So it's...
What, because government's not committed?
Because the government is dilly-dallying around with a 24 gigawatt commitment to nuclear power without committing to the only industry you have, which is Rolls-Royce. And the rest of the world wants to buy Rolls-Royce SMRs, but they want to see this country build it first, which is a simple industrial model. And I believe Rolls-Royce will be the dominant small modular reactor company around the planet. And from a UK perspective, it's the only industry you have.
Which is a very exciting opportunity. Do we have any realistic view of what the time frame is? You know, flash to bang. We say, right, OK, we're going to go for this. Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years?
So Rolls-Royce has announced that by 2030, which is not that far away in nuclear world, you could have power on the grid today. We believe with our approach, by bringing in private capital and innovation and commercialization, we can pull that left by a couple years. But the point is it's factory build. So I don't build one at a time. I get a factory going and I'm building 2 or 4 or 6 a year. That's how you drive down the cost curve. That's how you attract investment. And the most important thing is the industries of the future.
Final thought on energy. If we have these SMRs, do we need wind energy?
There's a place for renewable energy. But I will tell you this. It's more of a niche industry and a niche form of energy. Nuclear power is your baseload. Nuclear power in the form of an SMR can actually complement wind energy. So when the wind's not blowing, you can bring in the nuclear power.
Yeah, but when the wind's not, when the wind is blowing, it's still producing energy anyway, isn't it? I wonder whether we need wind energy.
Well, I will tell you this. If you really want to focus on the energy of the future, it's fossil fuel with clean carbon, which we have many ways to clean up the carbon, and it's nuclear power.
Well, I have to say, Mike, I'm sure it's not quite as exciting as being a naval aviator, but I think it's equally important. And thanks for coming on and sharing your thoughts with me on Talking Planes. OK, we've got a little bit of time left for Barrage to Farage. Let's see what crop you've got for me today. Marianne asks, why does Khan get away with being completely hopeless and yet Boris gets hauled over the coals for a piece of cake? The point is, Khan is not in Parliament. There is one absolute cardinal sin in politics. You may think there are many, but there's one absolute cardinal sin. You must not mislead the House of Commons, and that's what this grilling that he's had this afternoon is all about. Khan is not in the same position. Mary asks me, would you vote against the Windsor deal? You bet your blooming life I would. Why don't they just tell the EU to stop meddling in UK affairs? I'll tell you why, Mary, because for the European Union, this is desperately important. This means they've still got a hook into the United Kingdom. I blame Theresa May, Ollie Robbins and co for getting us into this mess in the first place. Boris, if you're being kind, was dealt a very bad hand of cards, he and Lord Frost. But they've got their hook into us. And my fear is that Euroscepticism is now very weak in the Conservative Party and in Parliament as a whole. And as time goes on, we'll find it more and more difficult to diverge from EU law, because otherwise the gap between us and Northern Ireland could become intolerable. Now, I showed you earlier on Steve Baker, who I've never had the highest regard for, I've got to tell you. Anyway, this idea of being a pound shop Farage. One MP was stopped by Sky News in a lobby earlier, and this was his response.
Steve Baker, former ERG chair, has now, obviously Northern Ireland minister, has basically compared Boris Johnson to a pound shop Nigel Farage by opposing the Windsor Framework. Are you a pound shop Nigel Farage?
Oh, I would take that as a great compliment. I would like to be the Woolworths of Nigel Farage's.
Jacob joins me now. Well done. That was very good.
For the wonder of Woolies.
Yeah, that was very, very good indeed.
Thank you.
Now, you did vote against this, didn't you, today?
I did, for exactly the reasons you set out. I think you're right that Boris was dealt a very bad hand. The original agreement was terrible. He didn't initially have a majority. But this, to my mind, solidifies the protocol, whereas in fact we needed to be moving away from the protocol, and your worry about a hook is a very valid worry.
Yeah, is that your big debate tonight?
I'm going to be talking about that, about Boris up in front of the Privileges Committee and riots in France, which is always a good topic to discuss.
Oh, they love a good riot in
France,
don't they?
They've been doing it for hundreds of years.
Yes, I know, and our retirement age will be 67, not 68, and theirs is still 62, and they don't want to budge. That's it from me. Jacob's taking over in a moment, but first, the all-important weather.
Hello there, my name's Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest broadcast from the Met Office. Staying unsettled over the coming days, a mixture of rain and showers. Some of those will be heavy, brisk winds too. And we can see that nicely on the bigger picture. Low pressure dominating the weather pattern. Brisk winds across the UK, outbreaks of heavy rain and showers, some of these thundery at times too, lasting right through the rest of the week and into the weekend. This evening we've got this band of showery rain pushing eastwards across the UK, some heavy bursts in there. Into the early hours we'll see further showers moving in. Some of these could be heavy at times, accompanied by some gusty winds, but in between there will be some clear spells. And temperatures not falling too low, generally 4 or 5 across Scotland down to 8 or 9 across southern England. So fairly brisk start to the day, Thursday morning. Strong winds, outbreaks of showery rain, which will be heavy at times, pushing their way eastwards across the country. There will be some sunny spells in between, stays blustery into the afternoon, further showers developing, and then also a more persistent spell of rain pushing into southern England. In any brighter spells, in any sunshine, with winds coming in from the south, could lift temperatures 12 to 14, locally 15 or 16 for some. This rain across the southeast of the UK continues to slowly slide away into the evening time. Elsewhere, clear spells just take us overnight into the early hours of Friday morning. Some heavy showers still. Again, the odd rumble of thunder is possible, some hail in those showers. And this will stop temperatures from dropping too low, generally 5 to 9 Celsius across the whole of the UK. So an unsettled start to Friday morning. Best of the sunshine initially across the southeast. Showers most frequent across the north and the west of the UK. Blustery winds continuing. And then into the afternoon, showers becoming more widespread. Some thunder in there too, some hail, gusty winds, and in between some sunny spells. Temperatures again above average. Temperatures sliding though into the weekend, more below average across the north of the UK. See you again soon.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB+ radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Co.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Click that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Co. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Woolworths of Nigel Farage's State of the Nation tonight. Being the mutinous, recalcitrant that I am, I voted